They sat me at table 12 behind a towering floral arrangement that blurred my profile like a portrait deliberately smudged. I smiled with the practiced politeness of someone who had rehearsed serenity in front of a mirror, and I thought to myself that the man across the room could not possibly imagine the storm he had agreed to walk into. 3 days later, he would hand me a folder with paper edges sharp enough to be funny for weeks. If you are watching, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I like knowing the map of people who prefer justice to silence. The wedding was designed to make people forget that fortunes can be fragile and that appearances often carry an invoice. My daughter Emily floated through her reception in a gown that caught the light and turned it into quiet applause. Charles Bennett arrived with the swagger of someone who believed money purchased taste and loyalty in equal measure. His mother Victoria moved through the room like visiting royalty whose diamonds had an appraiser on speed dial. The band played, the candles looked sincere, and everyone clapped when Emily and I hugged like a picture from a magazine. I felt small under the blooms, and deliberately small so they would not see the pulsing ledger beneath my calm. At the edge of the dance floor, Charles came over with a wine glass and a smile calibrated to be disarming. He said in that smooth voice people use when they want to be both confident and counselor, "I told you at brunch that I worry about older people being taken advantage of. We should talk about estate planning." I replied with soft amusement, "Oh good, you are worried about me. That is considerate." He reached into his jacket and produced a neat folder as if conjuring benevolence. His hand was steady, his kindness was a plan. We had met through the usual polite stages a family arranges when new relatives are introduced. He had offered help while my husband Mark was still alive and had sent him casseroles when the cancer made his appetite disappear. I had welcomed him. He had been attentive at first, asking about my health and asking about small things like whether my lamps had been left on at night. Those things are how predators learn not to alarm and how they learn to borrow trust. In public, he was generous. In private, he initiated conversations about power of attorney, about trustees, about efficiency. He used words that felt like protection and carried meaning like a quietly closing door. During dinner, he pressed the folder gently toward me and said, "We should make it easy for Emily. After you are gone, I do not want her to struggle." He spoke of protection and of simplifying my accounts. He used phrases like consolidated management and fiduciary efficiency. I listened. I looked at his hands. I cataloged each expression like a clerk tallying assets. He expected an immediate yes, or at least a soft enough refusal to be negotiated into a plan. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that is both closing and opening, and said, "That is thoughtful of you. Maybe we can discuss this properly over lunch." He brightened as predators do when a lead forms, and then he said, "Could we not do it now? My notary is on standby." He said now like it was a favor. I said, "No, thank you. Perhaps another time." He tilted his head a fraction, and that fraction gave me the map of his impatience. I practiced my harmless widow expression in the ladies' room the next afternoon. Soft focus eyes, modest pose, and I smoothed the hand that still wore Mark's thin wedding band. I priced the power of patience and planned to turn their rush into my advantage. I arranged discreet witness to future conversations. I made a signal with Gloria, my neighbor, who had come to help with the wedding cake delivery, a small cough that meant pay attention. I set a meeting where there would be witnesses and where Anna Ruiz, a lawyer friend who owed me a favor, could sit in the corner pretending to stitch a napkin. The plan was simple on paper, but it required care and timing and understanding of how the Bennett family used polite urgency as a wedge. Charles tried again at the luncheon 2 days later. He opened the discussion with the warmth of someone who had assembled a script. He said, "I get nervous about paperwork in families. It causes so many problems later, and what I have done here will save you both time and worry." Victoria chimed in with maternal concern. "Have a cup of tea and let us handle these things the way proper families do." Her voice had the smooth cut of someone who expected agreement as custom. I answered with the thin amusement that kept my advantage intact. "You are very kind to step in. I appreciate it, but I prefer Emily and I to consult with our attorney. We prefer to be deliberate." He smiled, but the smile now had the faint edge of irritation. We moved the discussion home. I had prepared the house with the paranoia of someone who understands small thefts often begin with a handshake. I smelled lemon oil from the polish on the sideboard, the scent of coffee cooling in a mug, and the soft cotton of the napkins. I felt the weight of the envelope in my bag more than I needed to. The room was not grand. It was honest and lived in the way Mark had liked it. Emily sat close and held my hand under the table. Anna introduced herself as Mark's old friend and said in a legal tone that had become conversational, "I will stay while you read through anything you are asked to sign." Simon Price, a notary, the one Charles had suggested, sat politely nearby and leafed through a small pad that looked casual but was careful. Anna had a pen ready and an extra chair. Leah Park, an investigator I had met through a neighborhood watch group, lingered by the doorway with a camera discreetly in her purse. The first attempt was to get me to sign a document called a temporary management agreement, a tidy title that masked the transfer of certain checking accounts and a small trust. Charles described it as sensible and loving. "He will preserve the house and handle bills," he would say about Emily. "She is young and busy. She must not be burdened." Victoria sniffed approval. The best families plan for every eventuality. He spoke in short sentences of notarization, witnesses, and immediate access. He painted press as kindness and speed as efficiency. I listened, and then I opened my mouth. "Not until I speak with my lawyer." He protested in a lower voice. "It is only temporary, Mom. The paperwork will keep everything in place." Emily leaned in and whispered to me, "Ma, maybe just another day." I felt the tug of fatigue and love, and then I felt the pulse of my own intuition. I set the trap by agreeing to a later meeting, but I asked for it to be recorded. I told Anna quietly while Charles smiled somewhere within earshot. "That man does not do anything without a benefit." She raised an eyebrow and said, "How far are you willing to push?" I said, "As far as it takes." When the day came, I had Leah Park wearing a discreet recorder in her necklace, and Gloria ready to sit in the kitchen where she could catch fragments from the hallway. I had Robert Chen, the bank manager, on speed dial, and a copy of bank statements tucked into a drawer in my desk. I had asked Emily to let me be her quiet strategist and not to react in the moment. She did not like lies, but she did like outcomes. The lunch was a performance. My senses were alive. The clink of china, the herbaceous lift from the salad, the metallic tang of a wine that did not suit me, the cloth under my fingers, the flutter of the curtains when someone walked past outside. We spoke of the weather, of the band, of the caterer, then of recipes, and then of legalities. Charles began with the gentleness he had perfected and slid a stack of papers across the table like a modest bribe. He read aloud in a soft voice. "This will ensure there is no argument in the future, and I will help to manage the funds." He called it protection again. I let him speak, I recorded, I asked questions designed to let him say what he intended aloud. "Did you intend to include the discretionary clause that allows immediate withdrawal? Did you intend the power to move accounts to a firm of your choosing?" He nodded, and the exchange was long and carefully structured. Charles said, "I only want what is best." Emily asked, "Do you mean to control her accounts?" He replied, "In a way, I hope will make you comfortable. They will be managed responsibly." Victoria interrupted. "She cannot be taken advantage of, not when someone else is willing to ensure her well-being." I asked Anna to clarify in plain terms, and she explained the implications in language without legalese, saying, This document would give someone control over access to bills, investments, and the ability to direct spending. Someone with a power of attorney could, if unscrupulous, act without immediate oversight. Robert chimed in via phone to confirm bank protocol that certain transfers can be initiated with physical documents and identification. The room felt like a courtroom and a kitchen at once. That dialogue was the net I had woven. I kept them talking until the words came out that would become evidence. My voice was calm and recorded. When you say manage, do you mean to exclude Emily from decision-making? He said, no, not exclude, protect. I said, protect? How exactly? He listed procedures with an ease that made the list damning. The access, the consolidation, the notary, the immediate execution. I asked Emily to stand and read aloud a clause, and she did with a voice that shook but read truth. It required courage to see what family can offer when family also calculates. After the lunch, I sent copies of the recording to Marcus Hale, a prosecuting attorney I had met at a community forum on elder protection, and to Anna, who began drafting a paper trail. Marcus responded that same evening with a terse line. We will open a preliminary inquiry. He asked for full recordings, bank statements, and a timeline. The next morning, a federal agent knocked on Charles's door. I had told Leah to wait to follow their lead. The sound of boots on the Bennett property felt like a heartbeat of justice. Victoria answered in a composed voice that was carefully practiced, and the agents presented their badges with a formal calm. I watched the newsfeed of their van leave the driveway like a ribbon being pulled. The discovery phase revealed a small architecture of greed. In a safe deposit box at a regional bank, there were copies of documents naming trusts and accounts that had been moved without Emily's knowledge. There were spreadsheets with line items for the monthly payment of assisted living-like accounts that did not yet exist, and instructions on transfer triggers. There was a note in a shaky handwriting that read, "For safekeeping, do not tell." The contents smelled faintly of old paper with a metallic hint from Staples. The air in the bank vault section smelled of cold stone and disinfectant, and the sound of the keys echoed like secrets being locked. Robert Chin and his compliance officer. Sarah showed us how certain electronic signatures had been routed through a third party they now flagged as suspicious. The technical description that followed from Anna explained how a power of attorney can be abused when paired with unilateral account control, giving access to withdraw funds and move assets to shell accounts in ways that evade routine monitoring. The legal procedure we used was straightforward, and I'm going to explain it simply so it reads like instructions, not law. A preliminary inquiry gathers evidence and testimony to assess whether a criminal investigation is warranted. If probable cause is found, the prosecutor seeks search warrants, arrest warrants, and asset preservation orders. Asset forfeiture allows the state to restrain or seize assets linked to criminal activity. This step protects victims while the case is built and requires documented links between the alleged crime and the funds. The order is typically temporary, but it buys investigators time to trace movements and freeze accounts before funds disappear. Over the next weeks, we gathered witnesses and statements. Leah Park took depositions from household staff and neighbors. Gloria described a late-night visit where Charles had appeared with a locked briefcase. Simon Price, the notary, admitted in a recorded interview that he had initialed pages without confirming a full review and that he had been offered payment more generous than usual. Victoria Bennett hired a solicitor named Frederick Ames, who spoke with the confident cadence of someone paid to delay. Frederick told reporters that his clients acted with concern and charity rather than motive. He said, "We offered help because that is what family does." The narrative he offered was tidy. It did not fit the paper trail. The arraignment was public. Marcus Hale stood up and presented a case built from recordings, witness testimony, bank records, and the trace of funds to accounts tied to companies registered in other states. The charges included fraud, exploitation of an elder, and conspiracy. When the judge read the bail conditions, the courtroom inhaled collectively. Charles was held on a bond set at a sum that reflected both flight risk and the magnitude of potential loss. The number was large enough to be headline-worthy, and it became one of the first metrics we used to show the seriousness of an alleged scheme. In the hallway after the hearing, a reporter asked me, "Did you expect this to snowball like this?" I answered, "I expected the truth to have consequences." As the prosecution unfolded, more names surfaced. We found that Charles had collaborated with an advisor named Peter Lonergan, who arranged transfers through a financial services firm in another state. There was a probate attorney in a neighboring county named Elaine Summers, who signed off on a procedural step without asking questions. A bank teller named Kevin, who had processed several withdrawals, provided testimony that his supervisor urged him to let certain transactions proceed without flagging them. The web widened, and prosecutors began to discuss the possibility of extending beyond our family. In small towns, rumors become currency, and soon other elderly residents came forward describing similar approaches from different members of the same network. I did not want the story to end with personal victory. Mark had always said that we should use whatever advantage we have to help others. So on the day the initial convictions were handed down, I stood in a courthouse press conference with Anna, Marcus, and Leah and spoke about a plan to convert my experience into prevention. We announced the establishment of a fund to provide free legal consultation for seniors and to create a rapid response team that could flag suspicious transfers between family members and financial institutions. We proposed a pilot program to train bank staff to recognize patterns of coercive control and to report them to a centralized hotline. Our preliminary target was 3 counties, and we proposed an initial budget to cover outreach, initial staffing, and training materials. Negotiations with local legislators were both mundane and slow. We met with State Representative Maria Gonzalez, who agreed to sponsor a bill to require banks to provide a pause period when certain high-risk transfers are requested for customers over a set age. We met with community leaders like Reverend Thomas, who had influence in local retirement communities, and with the director of an NGO named Safe Aging, Ruth Caldwell, who offered to partner on outreach. We engaged in long meetings with banks' compliance officers Robert Chin and an executive named Denise Brooks, who pushed back on the administrative burden but agreed to pilot alerts for suspicious transaction patterns in exchange for grants that would help cover technology upgrades. Negotiation was a series of small trades, moral urgency swapped for practicality. The legal case continued to evolve. Charles pled not guilty at first, then later changed plea when the weight of evidence and witness testimony made his position untenable. The sentencing included restitution provisions aiming to return money to victims and a prison term that reflected the gravity of exploiting trust. When the judge read the sentence, he spoke about the breach of trust that had been at the heart of the case and ordered a schedule for restitution that required account audits and monitoring. The money recovered was not total, but it was substantial enough to seed the fund we had announced. The numbers became a headline. The operation led to 8 arrests in 3 states and recovered $3.2 million in assets for victims so far. Those figures were a start, and they were a metric for others to use when arguing for policy change. There were moments of tension that left their marks. Once, after prosecutors had asked for a temporary seizure order on several accounts, I found myself awake in the early hours replaying every conversation I had had with Charles. The memory of us sharing a bench at Emily's school recital and him dropping a remark about portfolio management that later turned into a plan circulated through my thoughts. I had to decide whether to withdraw from public life or to stand even more visibly for others. I remembered a conversation with Mark in which he had said, "If you ever have something that can help others, you are obliged to use it." That memory pushed me toward public testimony. The tension between privacy and the need for public accountability made me hesitate for a day and then clarified for me the moral line I had to choose. Emily had her own trial by fire. She had to testify at the hearing and to face family who had taken her trust for granted. We had conversations late at night when the house was quiet and the kettle hissed and the moon poured silver through the drapes. She asked, Why did he do it? Why him? I told her, sometimes people are not what they seem, and sometimes they are simply calculating in a way that hides behind kindness. She cried, and I held her and refused to let her face the ordeal alone. Her testimony was steady, and it helped the case. It was painful, and it was necessary. The more we pulled at threads, the more we found that exploitation often sits in plain sight. Bank staff sometimes fail to flag patterns because policies are unclear or because training is minimal. Notaries sometimes sign without full verification because they are used to moving paperwork quickly. Families sometimes accept help because they fear conflict. Each failure was an opportunity to propose a fix. We drafted training modules with real-world scenarios and language for bank alerts that were easy to implement. We proposed a requirement that when a trusted contact is added to an account, a second independent verification must occur, and that a tailored waiting period should be allowed for transfers exceeding a threshold amount. The threshold was a political choice, and we debated it in meetings with economists and advocates and ultimately settled on an amount that balanced protection and autonomy. The pilot program launched with a town hall where I spoke, and the room was full of faces lined with past vulnerability. I described signs to watch for: cozying up of new family advisors, unsolicited concern about spending habits, surprise offers to manage accounts, and a pattern of urgency when documents were presented. I used the recording from Charles as a teaching tool, and we played short clips to explain coercive language. We provided a hotline and a quick response team that could advise banks and families in real time. The response was immediate and gratifying. Within 2 months, the hotline had fielded 50 calls and had referred 12 cases for investigation. Local news stories began to feature recovered funds and relieved families. Small numbers, but meaningful. As the network of investigations widened, there were consequences for many. Peter Lonergan pled guilty to conspiracy and received a sentence that included restitution and community service. Elaine Summers faced administrative disciplinary proceedings for failing to meet standards expected of probate counsel. Kevin the teller was suspended and required to attend compliance training. These outcomes were not a cure, yet they signaled that systems could react when citizens insisted on accountability. The fund we created helped 2 women hire counsel to contest sudden transfers and prevented a transfer of a retirement account that would have been catastrophic. Those cases became emblematic of why institutional responses matter. The subplot that emerged involved a neighbor named Gloria who had been quietly compiling names of people in the building who received unexpected visits. Her notebook became an informal registry and helped investigators connect dots across cases. Another subplot involved a local reporter named Daniel Ortiz who uncovered corporate filings that tied shell companies to transfers. Daniel and Gloria were unlikely allies, but together with Anna and Marcus, they formed a coalition that mattered. There were moments of betrayal, too, such as when a supposed ally from a nonprofit tried to use the publicity for their gain and had to be sidelined. The tangled human elements added texture to a case that might otherwise read like pages of procedure. Flashbacks came often and demanded detail. I recalled the afternoon Mark and I had met in a bookstore, the smell of old paper and tea, the feel of his coat when he offered his arm, the taste of instant coffee we pretended was better than it was. I remembered teaching Emily to swim, the sound of the pool echoing and the scrape of flip-flops on concrete and the small triumph of a 9-year-old who could finally float. I also remember the first time a stranger called, asking about our accounts, and my skin crawling, the metallic smell of the call, the way my stomach turned like a rope being pulled. Those memories were anchors, and they helped me keep perspective when days were long. There were tense moments that required decisions. In one 2-paragraph moment of crisis, I received a call that a bank intended to approve a transfer at the end of the day. I had to choose to move to court or to try to talk with the bank manager personally. The internal conflict was sharp. I could feel my pulse in my throat and taste adrenaline like copper in my mouth. I remembered Anna advising that a court order would be stronger than persuasion, so I chose motion over negotiation. The court issued a temporary restraining order and the transfer was prevented. It was a small victory that felt like a dam holding back a river. The trial culminated in a scene that felt cinematic even when it was tedious. Witnesses testified, months of depositions were read, and admissions were parsed. The jury listened, and sometimes its members nodded when they understood, and sometimes they appeared stumped. The prosecutor walked through the paper trail line by line, and Anna cross-examined witnesses with clinical patience. We saw sentences that reflected both retribution and restoration. There were appeals threatened and motions filed, and I learned how slow justice can be when it is meticulous. 1 month later, the landscape had changed in subtle ways. We had a team responding to calls, and the hotline had become a resource not only for crisis but for prevention. I attended community meetings and we distributed pamphlets. The fund enabled 5 pro bono consultations and 1 emergency injunction. Emily returned to work and found that people on the team called to check on her. The public recognition we received was awkward but effective. A local newspaper ran a feature, and the story prompted 2 more people to reach out offering documents that corroborated our narrative. 3 months later, the pilot program was expanded to include 2 more counties. The number of calls rose, and 1 case led to the discovery of a small network that had been exploiting seniors across state lines. We coordinated with federal agents, and the scale shifted. The fund had allocated resources to provide counseling and legal assistance to 8 families and had hosted training for bank tellers with a 90% satisfaction rate. 6 months later, we had a measurable impact. The new policy requiring a waiting period for high-value transfers had been adopted by 3 regional banks, and we had helped draft state legislation on elder protection that was moving through committee. The fund had helped recover additional funds and had supported a community outreach program that taught elders about digital security and red flags. At a small ceremony, the mayor presented me and Anna with a certificate of appreciation, and Marcus gave a short speech on the importance of civic action. The recognition felt strange and right. Throughout this process, the cast of characters remained essential. Emily kept me grounded and insisted on normalcy when I wanted to wear the victory like armor. Ana Ruiz organized the legal architecture and never let a deadline slip. Marcus Hale coordinated the prosecution and explained the limits of law with brutal honesty. Leah Park kept track of evidence and collected it like a careful librarian. Robert Chen became an unlikely reformer from within the banking system, and Sarah from compliance became our champion on the inside. Gloria documented community stories, and Daniel Ortiz turned data into narrative. Simon Price, the notary, faced consequences and agreed to implement better verification in his practice. Frederick Ames, the solicitor who defended Victoria, tried to argue that their intentions were pure, and in court he sought mitigation. Each person had agency, and each action rippled outward. There were costs. Relationships fractured. Some family members blamed us for the publicity. Victoria and I never reconciled. There were nights I could not sleep because the public persona of myself had become larger than the private woman I was. Emily bore the brunt of family strain, and we negotiated what privacy meant together. But we also found community in survivors who came to our meetings and told stories that no longer felt isolating. The conclusion of the legal arc was not a simple victory, but it forged policy changes. The program we seeded became a model that other counties adapted and that advocacy groups cited. The restitution did not replace every lost dollar, but it funded legal defense for others and paid for a small council to help elders review documents. The transformation from personal grievance to public program required that I choose visibility and to use resources, half of which were legal, half of which were patience, and the remainder stubbornness. If you were in my place, what would you do? If you have been in a similar position, start your comment with "I suspected when" and tell us the signs you noticed. Your stories help others learn to see warning lights. We read each comment and we find patterns that guide future episodes and training modules. Your voice matters. And so to close, he thought I was moving an inheritance like a piece of paper he could slide aside. He thought the widow in the photograph would be quiet. He underestimated routine and resource, and that miscalculation became the beginning of a network dismantled. We helped secure 8 arrests, recovered $3.2 million, and seeded a fund that now provides rapid legal response to elders in 3 counties. What began as private defense turned into public advocacy, and the law moved not only to punish but to prevent. Never underestimate someone who learned to use the law as a tool of protection. If this story matters to you, subscribe to stay informed and share your experience, because every shared warning makes it harder for the next predator to find a quiet table behind flowers.